Hello, this is Kathleen Ralph, creator of the webcomic Hope and Harry. I know how important support is for creators, which is why I support Andy and Derek and the Comics Alternative through Patreon.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Jessica Abel. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, we have the pleasure of talking with Jessica Abel. Her book, Out on the Wire, The Storytelling Secrets of the New Masters of Radio, was just recently released from Broadway Books, a part of Penguin Random House. But before we get into that great conversation, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful, incredible, unbelievable specials. Sometimes those discounts will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts go higher from there.
And if you like to buy your comics in bundles, which you should, there are a lot of great bundles in the month of October. We have a October Marvel relaunch bundle that's 50% off, a Marvel Kids bundle 50% off, a Valiant bundle also 50% off, and two Vertigo bundles. And the Vertigo bundle number 1, which is the 4 newest Vertigo titles, that is 75% off.
Yow!
Yow is right.
Yeah, great discounts, and October is Bundle Madness Month, but then again, every month is Discount Madness Month at Discount Comic Book Service. You gotta go to their website to see what they have and to believe the discounts. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your books there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Andy, we have a very enjoyable interview with Jessica, and this is a book that is very different from the kind of text that we normally cover on the Comics Alternative.
Yes, it is. It is a book called Out on the Wire, The Storytelling Secrets of the New Masters of Radio. And as we mentioned in the interview too, it's not just for people that are interested in radio, but lots of other endeavors as well.
Yeah, exactly. And while it's a different format from, or even you could call it genre, from the kind of comics that we usually look at, in many ways it's somewhat similar to those books that we refer to again and again. You know, she described Out on the Wire as kind of a documentary kind of comics storytelling. It also reminds me of what we see with other kinds of expository comics. You know, probably the most notable is Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics and his others in that series. But also there's something somewhat similar to the kind of history reportage kind of writing that we see in people like Joe Sacco or David Collier. So yeah, this is definitely right up our listeners' alley, and I hope that they will get a lot from our conversation with Jessica.
I hope so too. I think they will.
We're pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Jessica Abel. Her new book, Out on the Wire, The Storytelling Secrets of the New Masters of Radio, was just released the end of August. Jessica, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, you guys.
Now, your book has been out for a little over a month now, and I'm wondering if you can begin by telling us the kind of reaction you're getting from Out on the Wire.
It's been great. It's been really positive reaction, but also a really fairly intense reaction, which has been very gratifying, of course. You know, when you work on something alone in your studio for years, to suddenly like have it out in the world is really cool when people actually notice. And, you know, because it's a book about narrative journalistic long form audio, in other words, podcasts and radio, like along the lines of This American Life and Radiolab and so on. I was listening to these voices intensely for years. And it's been funny because I feel like all these people, you know, obviously they know me. I've interviewed them, you know, we talked and stuff, but like, I feel like I know them like best friends. Like they've been in my studio with me for 3 years. And they barely know me. You know, I interviewed them a couple of times and, you know, had a few follow-ups and this and that. And so I had this funny experience where I was on a book tour recently, and it brought me to San Francisco to did this really great event with Roman Mars of 99% Invisible and Glenn Washington of Snap Judgment. Big theater, the JCC San Francisco. So, you know, really large event. And so not only did I meet Roman for the first time, because I'd only ever interviewed him on Skype. So it was like, hey, we're best friends, big hugs. Oh my God, I've never met you before. And, you know, seeing Glenn for the first time in 3 years. And then Mark Ristich, who's somebody who, you know, comes up throughout the book in like a really regular pace, you know, and Julia DeWitt were both at the thing. And I was like, oh my God, Mark, you know, Julia, my best friend. And I'm like giving them big hugs. And they both had this kind of like deer in the headlights look initially. And they got over it. They were happy to see me, but it was just a funny, I don't know, it was a funny moment, you know? So like having it become real in the world and like being able to sort of actually enter into relationships with people about the work, you know, who are in the work because they've now seen it and experienced it it's a really great step forward. It's really nice. And I feel like, you know, because of the nature of the work too, it's just the beginning, even though the book came out and that's for many people, that's kind of the end. I feel like this is sort of the beginning.
Huh. Now you went into this a little bit, with what you were just telling us, but for those who haven't yet had the pleasure of picking up, as they well should, Out on the Wire, how would you describe this to our listeners who, well, one, don't know about the book, but may not even know about your work, shame on them, at all?
Well, maybe this should have gone first. The book is a nonfiction comic book, a documentary comic, or a graphic nonfiction or something, you know, how do you call those things? I don't know. About long form narrative nonfiction audio. So basically it's an investigation of how the best producers on the radio and podcasts, how they make their work. How do they think about it? How do they approach it from the inside? You know, what are the elements that go into great storytelling? And I tried to sort of pull those elements apart and, you know, make chapters on each one of them. And I interviewed and investigated 5 or 6 different shows, starting with This American Life in 1999. Actually, there's sort of a prequel to the thing, which is a smaller book that I did in 99 with This American Life about how they make their show. I didn't go back to This American Life specifically, but I did talk to Ira again. And then I went to Snap Judgment and Planet Money. And also Radiolab, The Moth, the Transom Story Workshop, which is a training workshop for this kind of production, these kind of producers, Radio Diaries, and 99% Invisible. And in some cases, I didn't actually go to, you know, where they produce, but I talked to the people who make the work. So that's, you know, something. There's approximately 35 characters in the book.
Jessica, now you mentioned that this is only the beginning, the book component, but you also have a podcast component that goes hand in hand with the book. How many people have you heard from that discovered the book first or the podcast first, and how many people are, you know, participating in both?
Oh, I don't know what the crossover is. That would be a really hard thing to figure out. I think that
Yeah.
most people so anyway, so yes, there's a podcast, and the podcast basically, I felt like when I finished the book that I hadn't really finished with the subject because there's so much material that I wasn't able to fit and different points of view that I wanted to get into. And also, I feel like, implicitly in the book, what I'm talking about applies to all forms of narrative art. So certainly to comics, that should be a fairly obvious connection, but also to prose writing and video. And, anytime you had to tell a story, most of these concepts are very much valid. But I felt like there's a lot more to say about that, about making connections between different forms of art, between fiction and nonfiction and those kinds of things. So I took my archival tape from my interviews and decided to build a podcast around that tape and around those ideas. And so the podcast is a limited series, limited run. It'll end. And it's on some of the same topics that are in the book. So finding an idea, making an idea better, characters. The one I'm working on right now is about, it's called Bare Bones. It's about structure and sort of like underlying, thinking about how you approach the getting into interviewing and so on, and preparing for interviewing and research. So, I think I try to be entertaining. I think it's entertaining whether or not you are a maker of stuff, but it's certainly aimed at people who want to make stuff. And because of that, I've set it up also so that at the end of these episodes, the end of the main episodes, there is a challenge for people to help them think about how to implement what's in that episode. And I created an online platform where people can collaborate on their work. And there's a pretty interesting, vibrant community of people working on stuff right now. So each of those, so the book itself, I don't know how many people have read it, but it's certainly, it's in many, many stores and people are talking to me about it. And I don't know what the numbers are yet. You know what I mean? It seems to be getting out there. The podcast is getting really good listenership. I don't know how many people who listening to the podcast actually have the book, although certainly a good number of them will be looking for it. And then you have the smaller number of people who have actually joined my newsletter, which is how you get into the group. And then the people who are in the group and the people who are participating in the group. So you kind of have these circles within circles, of who's actually involved in all this.
Yeah, I was fascinated with what you're doing with the podcast in that basically there are two kinds of episodes where there is what I would call the main series that you have, where, as we have in the inaugural one, where you have actually quite good production value. And listening to that, I think one would be challenged to discover many differences between what you're producing in your Out on the Wire podcast episodes and the kind of programs that you discuss in your book, like Radiolab, like This American Life, the way that it's put together. But then you also have that other strain for the podcast.
That's very kind. And credit goes to my producer, Benjamin Frisch, for the professional level of production.
Very well done. In fact, kind of makes us ashamed, those of us who are amateur podcasters doing this, wishing we had better production quality. But then the other strain that I see in the podcast is the workshop, and that's not as produced. And in a sense, it seems much more immediate, where at least an episode that I listened to, you and Benjamin and your husband Matt are talking about projects that people have wanted to share on the website, and you go back and forth about the pros and cons, or whether something may be a tenable idea. And I think that both of those are very useful ways of going about this project of the podcast, because you're taking what you do in Out on the Wire, the book itself, and you're putting not only displaying what one could do with these ideas, skills, and equipment, but also putting that into practice for other people as well, or helping them to do so.
Right. Well, that's the premise of the whole of the way I've structured the podcast is that collaboration is key. Collaboration is the way that the best work gets made. That it's through, getting your ideas out in public and talking about them with other people and getting feedback on them. That is how these shows make the work as good as it is. And so I wanted to facilitate that for people. And so the workshop, you're right. So there's the primary episodes, which have like the primary numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, are fully written, fully produced episodes using essentially the techniques, that I've learned by studying these various shows. Although I have to say, are fully amateur, and this is totally seat of our pants invented. I mean, Ben has some experience. He was an intern at NPR, and he's done, audio production on his own a little bit. But he's also, this is a new level for both of us. Then interspersed between those episodes, we have these workshop episodes, and workshop episodes are recorded live. Like yours are. They're probably more edited than yours are. Like I know that the workshop episode we've only done 2 of them so far, for 2.5. So they're numbered 1.5, 2.5, et cetera. So they're linked to the main episode. Episode 2.5 we just recorded a couple weeks ago, and we're just sitting in our little tiny studio together and talking. We talked for an hour and a half, I want to say, and it came out at 45 minutes. So Ben cut out a lot of stuff. He cut it down a lot. So it's still edited, but it's edited from just live discussion. And most of it, there's a lot of that feeling of just live conversation that comes out through it. And, the point is to not only help the individual people whose work we single out from the working group, but to also demonstrate how this works and how it can help to everybody else who's listening. Because, necessarily podcast being podcast, people will come to this months or years later and be listening to these things. And they're not going to have a chance to, submit their work in order to be on the workshop episode. But that's okay. They'll still, I hope, understand from how this all kind of plays out in the workshop episode, what a workshop looks like, what you can do to make something better via collaboration.
Jessica, early in the book, you, as the narrator, speak 2 sentences that I'd really love, and there's so much about the book that I really do love. But there's 2 sentences, and they start, they, meaning the people on the radio programs, speak the truth with recognizable voices and sound like real human beings, allowing us to connect to their stories through the passion that we hear. This feels so right to us today when authority comes from directness and authenticity, not distance and formality. And then you say something like, but at that point you were at Radio France and you hadn't figured any of that out yet. What was it like to figure that out, that moment or those moments of revelation?
Well, I don't know if I could call it a moment of revelation or even moments, more like months of revelation. Like it, coming to that preface, the entire preface, there's like a 2 or 3 page section where I kind of lay out my thesis for like, why are we reading this book? It's, if you to use a phrase from inside the book that I talk about later, that's framing. I'm framing the book for everybody, saying like, this is why we're reading. This is why we care. But I had to write the entire book before I could write that stuff. So that came last. Like that's the last stuff I wrote. That maybe the epilogue was really the last thing, but like just about. And it was really quite difficult to like pin down what it is that was. What are the specific sort of bullet point list of things about these shows that make them special? I mean, I had gone through, all of this thinking about what, how they make their sound and how do they select the things that they use and, all these other elements. But like globally, what makes them really good? Well, and that's one thing. And actually, in some ways, that particular moment that you pulled out, that's something that comes from, I couldn't phrase it until very late, but like way back at the beginning in my proposal stage for this book, one of the things I was thinking about, I think it came from, I want to say there was a talk that Ira Glass gave at a, public radio gathering of some kind that compared this approach, this voice, and I think he might have specifically been talking about Radiolab. I don't know, but like he compared it to blogging. He's like, there's this kind of directness and sort of, there's like a DIY kind of feel in some ways, although there's obviously this professional polish, there's something like super direct about the way that we want people to communicate now. And he's always been fighting against that sort of voice of authority, that like super controlled kind of voice of God approach that we sort of associate with old timey, radio and TV announcers. He's been fighting to like get that out of his own presentation for his entire. I mean, fighting. He fought. It's out, but like, went through a long process of making that happen. I think in his own work, in his own narration and writing, and it's it's difficult. It's obviously really difficult. I think even if you listen to like, I've only finished 3 episodes now, 3 full episodes of my own podcast. But if you listen to episode 1 and episode 3, you can totally hear the difference in my own reading of my script. That it's a lot more natural. So I don't know. I mean. That's a long way of saying not very much, but like the thing that I was attracted to about that particular concept is it's almost punk rock. It's almost like just take the thing that's inside you and communicate that thing directly. Don't censor yourself. Say it in a way that's careful in the sense that you want to be accurate about how you feel and not sloppy. Like not just say whatever, but like write carefully. But write carefully in a way that's totally true to who you are and the way that you actually talk. And if you can't say it out loud and sound like yourself, then rewrite it. It's just not right.
Well, and I want to tie that into what you said earlier about feedback and having a community. One character in the book says, I don't really see any way of making this work without feedback. And I know a lot of people that create are really terrified to take that step, to get that feedback. And I think this is great that you're allowing this this platform that you have tied into the podcast to allow people to do that. And I hope a lot of people take advantage of it.
Well, I mean, like I said, we've got a really good group so far. I mean, it's hard to count in the format because it's a Google Plus community. So everything kind of flows, but I think we probably had, 50 or 60 people posting, and there's 300 people plus in the group. So, and I think that, people who are posting, they're like, it's clear that they're hungry for that kind of feedback. And I think, yeah, there's this battle constantly in artists to allow yourself to be vulnerable to other people, allow yourself to put your work out and then not wanting to, kind of pulling back from that and feeling intimidated by what you're going to hear and not ready to hear it and so on. But I think it's an incredibly important skill to develop on both sides, on the side of the person giving the critique and the person receiving the critique. This is a skill set that I think we just all need to build. And we need to build this. I just really believe that we will make better work if we build the process of giving and receiving feedback into many stages of the work, not just at the end. And this is one of the problems is like you spend all this time on your own coming up with this little world and doing this thing. You get to the end of it and then somebody's like, oh no, it doesn't work. And you feel crushed, right? But if you sit down, the first month you're working on it and say like, well, here's what I'm working on. And somebody says, well, I don't understand this part. And then you say, oh, well, it's because of this. And they say, oh, well, that makes more sense. And then you kind of work out the kinks in your idea from the very beginning. You're used to it and you know what's coming. It's not the same situation. And of course, there's a value to having clean feedback, somebody who's never heard a thing, later in the process. And so you sort of want to reserve people for that. There's some kind of strategy that goes on there too. But I feel like there's Soren Wheeler, who's the one who you're talking about there in the book. He's just absolutely, he's absolutely an advocate of what he calls iterations. So bringing stuff out, putting it in front of other people, brainstorming in public with other people, not in public, but in groups with other people, getting their feedback, and then bringing it back inside, working on it by yourself, subjecting it to your own criteria only, then bringing it back out and back in and back out and back in. And I think that's very wise. I think that works incredibly well. And in fact, that's really how I made this book.
Mm. Now, the book is all about radio. And another thing that you do at the beginning, Andy was talking about the way that you're setting up the text. You give us a little insight, the reader a little insight about what brought you to this project. And in setting this context, and I'm specifically looking on pages 6 and 7, you're explaining that, when you and Matt a number of years ago were living in Mexico, you used to listen as best you could to public radio, these kind of programs that you really enjoyed listening to, like This American Life. And that's around that time where you got a call from Ira Glass asking you to help by contributing that, or to creating the book Radio: An Illustrated Guide. And by the way, I have to tell you, I love the inclusion of Matt's 99 Ways to Tell a Story on that page.
Well, you guys are pretty much the target audience for that particular page.
Because I looked at the composition of that panel and I said, yes, exactly. That's where that's going. But we know there in that intro that you're interested in these kind of radio programs. But what I'm curious about, though, is I guess before that time, what brought you originally to this kind of radio?
Well, I mean, when we say this kind of radio programs, we're talking about 1998 here. Mm-hmm. The only one was This American Life.
Right, but I mean, it's not listening to top 40 radio or alternative music radio. In other words, I mean, I remember that from my own experience, listening to public radio, I can remember moments where I made conscious decisions to listen to, and not necessarily story programming, but just public radio in general, which is quite different from what everyone else that I knew was listening to. And so I'm wondering what brought you to the kind of radio listening that eventually got you to This American Life, that eventually led to other programs.
Well, short answer is I'm a cartoonist. And when you are a cartoonist, you have many, 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 many hours in which you are sitting doing drawing or something, and you need to fill your part of your brain that isn't, concentrating on inking with something else. And so you listen to music, you listen to this, you listen to that. But I listen to a lot of public radio because there are a lot of great shows, music shows and news. And, I've always liked, All Things Considered and whatever. And I don't know, I just found it, it was just there. And I have always been somebody who's, when I am working, I'm incredibly concentrated. Like, I don't like to, I don't wiggle. I don't get up and do stuff. I just do the thing I'm doing. And so I would put on, and this is, in the age of turntables, the mid 90s. And I would put a record on, and it would play a side, and then it would go off, and then it would just be off for like an hour and a half until I remembered to get up and turn it over. So that's how I listened to This American Life, because it was on after something I was listening to, and I had nothing else I wanted to listen to, and I listened to it, and I got really interested in it. I mean, it was instantly interesting. And in fact, I listened to the earlier version of it called Your Radio Playhouse, I think it was called. Because I was in Chicago, and Ira was in Chicago, and it was like a local show, and the first couple episodes or something were called that, and then they went national with a different name. And in fact, I didn't listen to the show before that. I just was a WBEZ fan. I listened to what was on.
Jessica, there's a section where Jay Allison is quoted in the book saying, "The moment you know you have a story is the moment you realize it's not the story you thought it was." Can you give us an example of that in your own work and how you handled it?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, with this book, the moment I realized it wasn't the story I thought it was, was it a moment? No, but it was a period in which I went from thinking that it was going to look a lot sort of like Radio: An Illustrated Guide, which essentially walks you through the stages of producing a show. So there's one show, it's a 30-page, actually it's 24 pages in this iteration, but a 24-page section where you go through all the stages of getting a story idea, and then collecting the tape, and then editing the tape, and writing, and so on and so on. And I thought that I was going to be doing that, but with 5 different shows at the same time. Mm. And I realized at some point that would be incredibly boring, because much of it is very similar. And I just decided not to do, I was like, oh, well, I guess I have to organize it a totally different way. And then I started organizing it around concepts instead. So around ideas and characters, and the edit, meaning the critique session, and sound and structure. So those, that reorganized all of my thinking, because I started out thinking I was going to have a chronology, and ended up not having a chronology, which was a very, very big difference. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I do think that happens with most major works. I'm not sure it happens with everything that's kind of, like smaller things, like you may know what it's about to begin with, but there's, you have to choose. Like there's always a moment where you go, oh, well, is it really about this? Is it really about this other thing? With my book, Trish Trash, I think there's a moment where there are two main sort of levels to that book. One is that Trish is this Martian teenager who really wants to be a roller derby star, or hover derby star, excuse me. In the future, there are no wheels. And that's the main sort of, that's the sort of spark that kicks everything off. So that there's this, tryout, blah, blah, blah. So she wants to be a hover derby star. But then there's another arc to the book, which is really sort of the meteor arc, which is about how Mars is subjugated by this giant corporation that kind of has control over everybody, and economically speaking, not, politically, although of course they converge. And there's no water, and nobody knows why there isn't any water, and just people are just really suffering. And so what's going to happen with that? That's the other arc. And I think that at some point as I was writing Trish, the second thing about the water and the company Arex and so on is obviously, more significant in a larger sense. And so I think I got really wrapped up in that, and I kind of forgot that Trish wants to be a roller derby star. And Matt at one point was like, Jessica, your book is called Trish Trash, Roller Girl of Mars. If she's not Roller Girl of Mars by the end of this book, you've made a grave mistake. And I was like, oh, Dad, okay. All right, reworking. So, and that really helped. I mean, that's where we're going with it. You know what I mean? That helped put it together. So in some senses, that was like the double of the Jay story, where at first she wants to be in my first conception, it's about, a silly story about a girl who wants to be, a roller derby star. And then I'm like, oh no, but there's all this cool stuff about Mars and world building, blah, 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 blah. And I got all distracted, and then thought it, it was like, oh, I thought it was going to be about roller derby, but it's really about this. And then it was like, no, it's really about roller derby also. So there's that kind of process, I think, happens all the time when you're working on something that's, long and deep and complex and stuff.
You're talking about Trish Trash, and you did bring this up in one of your episodes of the podcast as an example of what we were just talking about, collaboration. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about the birth of Trish Trash and how you came to this concept.
Well, it's kind of, it's a funny story in that it comes out of just virtually nothing. It comes out of what this is an example of in the podcast is how you build an idea. People go around all the time, you're a panel discussion or something like that. People are always asking you, how do you come up with your ideas? Like it's some magic formula. And it's totally not. You just find a thing that that captures your attention enough. And then you dive into it and you make it, you find things to kind of glom together with it. And, it grows, it grows in complexity, it grows in depth and interestingness. And it's about paying attention to your attention. So the Trish Trash story is that we were working on our textbook, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, which is, we didn't get through Who I Am other than this book, by the way. But that was my previous giant thing, which is a set of 2 textbooks about how to make comics that I wrote with Matt.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about those as well, eventually.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Well, we'll do that next. Anyway, so Trish was just an illustration for the character chapter. She was an illustration of a method of coming up with characters out of absolutely nothing, just a list of characteristics. And Matt gave me some characteristics and I invented her and I did an illustration. And it was just what popped into my head and it was funny and cool. And so I drew it. And then she just kind of stuck. Like the idea of a roller girl on Mars just stuck in my head. And I found myself still months later thinking about it and then starting to build it, starting to find other stuff to bring into the story. And, at first, as usual with me, I'm like, it'll be fun. It'll be quick. It'll be like, I don't know, 100-page thing. And I'll get somebody to work with me on it, and draw the pictures and I'll just write a script and then I'll be on to the next thing. And it's now like 8 years later, 9 years. So that's just how it is.
Now, Trish Trash is in French, but you do provide on your website a link to the English script. But are we going to see a English language version of the book, Trish Trash?
Yes, I'm in talks about that right now.
Okay.
So probably in the fall, the first volume will be out in English.
That's good. I was hoping you would say that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm excited to have it in English. I mean, I've been talking about it with people, people are excited about it for years, and just to have it, this kind of like exist and yet not exist on my home planet is, it's tough. It'll be nice to have it in English in the U.S.
Now, you mentioned just a moment ago your 2 books with Matt, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, and then the one after that, Mastering Comics. And, these are instructional texts, very different from your previous work like Le Perdita, Life Sucks, and then your early series Art Babe. I'm wondering how much of your work with Matt in those 2 books went into the actual project of Out on the Wire, or maybe another way of asking this is, could Out on the Wire have come to be without first going through Drawing Words, Writing Pictures, and Mastering Comics?
Well, to answer the second part first, I think it could have, but I don't think that I would have. I think it would have been a lot harder. And it's not so much, I don't know, like going through the process of writing, 30 chapters of instruction on making comics, which is a process of codifying, in some sense, the things that I do in the classroom. Is really, really important for me to, as part of my process in figuring out what I think about making art, making comics, making narrative, and figuring out what I want to say about it, in public. What do I want to present to the world, and how do I want to lead people through it? And all of that work and teaching totally feeds into Out on the Wire. Now, Out on the Wire is not an instructional book. It's not intended to be like a textbook. Now, people are using it in classes, and I'm thrilled that they are. It's very exciting to me that people are using this in classes. But it's not set up as a textbook. Drawing Words and Writing Pictures and Mastering Comics are. They're activities, they're, all this stuff. Out on the Wire is meant to be read by people who just like these shows as much as by people who want to make these shows. So there's a big difference there. And that's one reason why I did the podcast too, because there's all this sort of pedagogicalness in me that I wanted to like get out somehow. And so that kind of went into the podcast instead of into the book. But so all of that is, it's all tied together. But, before that, I mean, I think if you go back to Radio and Illustrated Guide, which is, again, the smaller book that I did with Ira Glass, that most of that book is included in the preface of Out on the Wire, that I did that book in 99, which is basically before I started teaching, sort of around when I started teaching. I'd maybe done one class before that, I guess. And that, in some ways, marks the beginning of this whole process, if you see what I'm saying. Like, that was a way of like breaking down a storytelling system, not my storytelling system, but one that I could learn a ton from. And the fact that there was a system was incredibly helpful to me as an artist, and then also later as a teacher. The idea that you could systematize this stuff, that you could think about it in stages and steps, that things that you could communicate to somebody else, all of that was really, really important. And so I think only now that I've finished Out on the Wire do I realize how much this is an entire arc of work for me. Like the whole project of thinking about telling stories is, what I've been doing for 15 years now.
Jessica, the most challenging part of podcasts for me is having Derek steal my questions before I can ask them. And that was one of them. But I wanted to ask kind of a similar question, but in a different slant. You've been talking about your other work, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, Mastering Comics. Clearly, you're passionate about teaching and helping people meet their artistic goals and needs. Can you talk a little bit about where that desire comes from?
I can try, but I don't know that I'll have an answer for that, because I feel like that's just something that's in me. The first time I can sort of mark a moment when I started trying to teach people or trying to help people, with comics and with, telling stories, goes back to my first website, artbabe.com. which I put together before I moved to Mexico. So in 97, I guess. And on that site, I put a DIY guide, a do-it-yourself comics guide. And basically it was super simple. It's actually still, a version of it is still on my website today, because people still use it in classes and things, which is nice, although it's totally needs updating because I just updated my site and it's all kind of half broken, but it's still there and it'll get better when I fix it again. But basically it was a super simple thing where there was one section on tools. So what kind of brushes, what kind of pens, rulers, whiteout, non-whiteout, whatever, what do they look like? There was one on my process at the time of laying out and penciling and inking a page, which is totally not my process of today, but it's useful anyway, I think, in the steps. There was how to make a mini comic. So that's the thing people use the most, I think, now, which is like how to lay out pages, how to make a mock-up, etc. And a couple other things. So, and what that came from for me was when I was coming up as a cartoonist in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, like there was no internet. Not like there was no internet. There was no internet. And so there was no place to, now there's a million places you can, YouTube videos and who knows what all. There's like a million places you can find this stuff. There are my textbooks, which now exist, that will teach you all of those things that you need. But there was none of that when I was learning to be a cartoonist. And I didn't really, I knew a couple other cartoonists, but I wasn't like pals with any of them. I went to school with Ivan Brunetti, so, there are a few people around. But I didn't hang out with Ivan. And so I didn't have anybody to kind of like compare notes with. And so I actually was subscribed to a couple like email newsletter or groups. What do you call them? Mail lists things. Mm-hmm. And one of those was it was called Ink something, I forget. People would like post, there was, text documents with information about tools and things. And I kind of cut and pasted and saved that stuff. And like, that's all I had. And I just felt like this is idiotic. Like there should be a way to share this information in a way that's useful, And so when I figured it out, I wanted to tell other people. I didn't want other people to have to go through what I went through. And in some ways, that's like my whole journey as a teacher is like, it doesn't have to be this hard. Making art is hard enough as it is. Just going through the intellectual and, emotional process of making art is really, really hard. Let's make the rest of it easy. Let's make all the parts about like how to lay out a page and like what kind of tools to use and all that other stuff. Let's make that super easy. Let's systematize how you can come up with ideas and how you can, build those ideas into something better. It's going to be different for each person, obviously, but like, let me give you some tools and let's, skip over the really stupid part and skip to the, nitty gritty of what we're trying to do here. And the collaboration part too, it's like that. If you look back at me 20 years ago, essentially, what I was really looking for was what I'm doing right now in this group. That's what I wanted. I wanted a group of people who would help me, nail down what my ideas were and build them into something better and who could tell me about tools and who would be there, to do critiques and who, that's what I wanted and that's what I needed. And if I had that, my own work would have been, it would have been jet fuel.
We were talking about learning early in your career and the struggles that young artists go through, even with the internet now, with a lot of information at their fingertips. I'm wondering if you can speak a little more about your time when you were first starting off with your Art Babe comic. It was a Xeric winner, and it eventually went on to get noticed by Gary Groth at Fantagraphics. Do you miss writing comics in that way? Because there's really nothing like Art Babe that you've done since.
Can you be more specific?
Well, in writing in a serial form, well, I guess, La Perdida was a serial form comic, but it had a longer ongoing storyline.
Yeah.
Do you miss those kind of short stories or done-in-ones or whatever you choose to call them?
Yeah, Art Babe is an omnibus title along the lines of like, I'm sure I modeled it on like 8-Ball or something, like the
right.
There were at the time a whole bunch of titles that were like collections of short stories, and sometimes there'd be a serialized thing that was part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew that given distribution at the time, and the fact that people didn't know who I was, and initially we're talking the mini comics era, Art Babe, because there were two runs of Art Babe. One was a mini comic that was self-published and Xeroxed, and then after it got picked up by Fantagraphics, there was a Fantagraphics published floppy comic, one. So in the mini comics era, we had, there were a lot of models for that kind of work then, that kind of comic. It was like an anthology of one, which is, it's, the official word is like an omnibus. And do I miss making short stories? Not really. I don't. It's not my natural form. It's challenging for me. It's challenging for anybody because, short stories are really hard to do them well, really hard. But it's not something I'm naturally attracted to. I find that every time I try to do something that's like even a short graphic novel, like 120 page or 80 page or something like that, it's just really difficult for me. Like I really want to keep going and make something more complex and more, just like I don't feel like I have enough space to do what I want to do this kind of storytelling I want to do in short stories. But at the time I didn't have in any way the storytelling tools. I didn't have the storytelling tools even to tell short stories, much less to tell something that was long and complex. And that's partly why when I came back from Mexico, I started working on La Perdida then in 2000. I felt ready. I had done 10 years worth of short stories very slowly. So it wasn't actually a lot of short stories, but, like enough that I felt like, and they'd gotten longer. So like my last issue of Art Babe there was a single story and there was like 28 or 30 pages. And then I did Radio and Illustrated Guide, and that helped me sort of codify and think through some of my ideas about story and how I wanted to tell stories. And I felt like I was ready to start something longer.
Now, originally, La Perdida was serialized through Fantagraphics. The collection was published with Pantheon. And, since those days, your publishing history seems to be primarily through larger publishing houses. There is, Pantheon, which is, part of Random House with La Perdida. You and Matt were general editors of the Best American Comic series for a while from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. How do you think your work has changed over the years now that you're working with larger trade publishers as opposed to, maybe going with more down the line traditional comics only or comics primarily publishers?
I don't know that my work has changed as a result of being with larger publishers. I don't think that that's how.
Well, the way that you conceive of your projects and the way that they come about, because there's a whole different dynamic that goes on.
Yeah, I think that the old dynamic that I grew up on of the individual issues, floppies, and then collecting into books, almost doesn't exist anymore. It does in more sort of adventure-oriented comics,
or mainstream
stuff, or deeper genre stuff. If it can get published by Marvel, DC, Image, or Dark Horse, maybe there's there are individual issues, and that range is bigger than it used to be. It's not just a few things. There's a lot of things that can fit in that, but it's a small and shrinking part of what happens in comics these days, which is a problem, I think, especially for younger cartoonists who either A, don't have that much to say yet, or B, are still mastering their craft and need to have a lot of practice. They do shorter things for a while, but there are very few venues in which you can really publish short work other than online. And so that's a problem. But for me, as I said, like my tendency as a writer is to want to work longer and more complex. And so there's nothing attractive to me at this point, except maybe financially doing a bunch of individual issues and then collecting them, because then you sell it twice. But it's a little bit appealing in the sense that you get feedback along the way, like people read it and they like it and, talk to you about it and they know what's going on and it's sort of exciting, but it's like kind of just not the work that I've done before. Now, all that said, I'm now working in sci-fi with Trish Trash, obviously, and it will be serialized in 3 books. And they're like 3, 55 to 65 page books or so, so it's not individual issues, but it is serialized. So I'm back in it, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
I guess it sort of depends on the project. And if I continue working on sci-fi and do more books that are sci-fi, then, it's possible that I'll stick with the serialization model because it works more in that world, works better in that world. If I want to go back and do more like, naturalistic fiction like La Perdida, I wouldn't serialize. I don't think that the market's there for it.
Jessica, I'd like to move back to Out on the Wire for just a second. There's a really wonderful scene about halfway through the book involving mathematician Stephen Strogatz.
Mm-hmm.
He's describing traveling on a boat in a river in Thailand and the sounds and sights there. And in that scene, I think it's Jad Abumrad says of Strogatz, he was feeling a sort of awe. We're always chasing the moment of awe. Do you think that's what a lot of people that create hope to achieve, at least on some level, that moment of awe, and that I call it like a childlike sense of wonder?
I think that's one thing that one can aim for. I think that Jad in that scene is specifically talking about trying to tell science stories and how do you take apart the voice of a scientist who often tends to speak very carefully and guardedly, trying to be very accurate and factual and so on, and to try to break into that and give access to something that will involve the average listener who is not an expert in that field, or even somebody who is. How do you really connect a listener to the idea and to the person? And that's one way, is that moment of awe, that moment of, revelation that a scientist will have. And, scientists are passionate about their work if you can just get at that,
Yeah.
You can just get, connected to that passion that they have. I think that's really important. So that's the specific case there. For me, I think that there are moments when, in my own work, when I'm looking for that moment of awe, but I don't know that that's definitely not my only aim. What I do aim for, I think, is to really deeply connect my readers to my work and make them really care about what's happening. And that can cause them to be, upset or angry as much as experience awe, be happy, be whatever, like reading a book like La Perdida, you're going to be upset. You're not going to be full of awe.
Yeah.
I hope you're upset.
Yeah.
That's, that would be a healthy response to what happens. I hope you feel sorrow at what happens. And there's a sort of catharsis in that, but I don't know that it's that awe is an aim for everybody at all times.
Well, one of the things like the scene that you just mentioned that I really appreciate about the book is there are instances where someone is trying to communicate a difficult concept, and especially with science. And I've listened to a lot of those shows, and in the book you talk a lot about how to make that approachable for an average listener without either boring them or giving them too much information. But for me, as somebody that likes to write, one of the things I like to write are short stories. And I was kind of inspired by that section because it just seems to me if we're able to communicate difficult concepts like science, then maybe there's a chance I can communicate what my character is going through in this scene. So for me, this was a very inspirational section of the book.
Oh, that's nice. That's a nice connection to make. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, I think that's right. Like you can certainly, that's the thing about the book in general is that there's so many crossovers between the specific things that these producers are talking about and other elements of other kinds of narrative work and other, stages of other kinds of narrative work. There are many, many applications of this no matter what you're doing. I've talked to people reading it who are choreographers thinking about how it applies, who are architects, who are, there's so many ways to think about storytelling in different media. And many of the things in the book, apply across the board.
I would, when one of my big concerns, and I'm telling people about the book, that, it's not just for people that are interested in radio. It's for novelists, it's for filmmakers, songwriters, as you said, architects, choreographers. Anybody in any creative field is going to be able to get something out of this book.
Boy, I hope so. That would be great.
And Andy, I'd go on to say not just limited to the creative field, because I know in my own work, I don't teach from a more hands-on, practiced, creative standpoint. I mean, I come from a literary criticism background, and so the kind of courses that I teach are more what you would call criticism, appreciation, theory. In reading Out on the Wire, Jessica, I noted that the two of the earlier chapters, ideas and character and voice, those are two that really stood out for me. And the reason they stood out is because I thought these would be really good to use to have my students read the next time I teach my course on narrative theory. Because I think, they have a lot to do with, how what one should think about in terms of storytelling in radio and then in other creative endeavors, as Andy was pointing out. But I think what you and then the people you interview reveal is that there are certain mechanisms that are going on. Basically what they're doing is they're pulling aside the facade and showing to some degree the scaffolding that lies underneath narrative, how one tells stories, how stories are put together. And I think that these two chapters in particular would be very valuable in a kind of narrative theory type course.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the storytelling secrets. That's what it is, and that can be super useful if you're trying to tell stories, but it's also super useful if you're trying to understand how stories are told. It's the same, I feel the same way about drawing words and writing pictures and mastering comics, that there's a ton in those books for people who want to read comics and understand how comics function. That there's just a lot. Whenever anybody sort of effectively goes through the stages of making narrative, then there's a lot to get out of it from the reading angle as well, and the critical angle.
Now, I want to ask you also about your work, to something I alluded to earlier. You're in Matt's editorship of the Best American Comics series, because not too long ago, the two of you handed off the reins to Bill Cardelopoulos, who's now overseeing the series. You and Matt, was it the second or the third volume that you guys started?
Third.
The third. You had quite a long run on that. I imagine how exhausting that might be. Were you happy to hand over the reins finally, or was it something you guys did with maybe a little regret and sadness?
We were happy to hand over the reins. There was regret in that one of the good things about being series editors is that I did feel like I had a handle on what was going on in comics in the US and Canada for 6 years. I kind of knew, I had my finger on the pulse a little bit. And now, especially having moved to France immediately after stopping, I have no idea. I went to SPX this year. I'm just like, I don't know what's going on here. I recognize schools, of work, this sort of belongs with that and whatever, but there are all these people I'd never seen before, all this stuff going on. So I have no idea what's going on right now. And so I regret that. But it is an enormous amount of work to go through all of those comics and to find them, track them down, and keep track of what you have and what you need. And, it's just there's a lot of administration that goes into it. So the creative work of thinking of what's really great and, all that stuff it's a small proportion of the overall job. And we were happy to hand that off. Mm.
So what was the most difficult or frustrating or challenging part of being series editors?
Well, those are different things. The most difficult part was picking. Obviously there are things that stood out that were obviously going to be in the pile. And then there are a lot of things that were borderline, and we had to make decisions about those things, and that was always tough. The most frustrating thing was, tracking people down to send you stuff and making sure you get everything and make sure it's all in the computer, who had what and who's read what and, all that kind of stuff. That's frustrating and not in a good way. Just whatever administration crap. It's not worth getting into the details, but that's the part that's no fun. Like I don't mind, like I enjoyed the difficult work, the intellectual work of thinking through, what would make it onto the notables list, because we didn't get to decide what was actually going to be in the book, of course. Like we would make a pile of between 100 and 125 things and send those things to the guest editor each year, and then he or she would pick what was going to go in the book. And so we were basically making the notables list then out of everything else that we felt like also deserved to be picked, but wasn't for whatever reason.
I know one of the things we've mentioned a few times on the podcast, because every year, in fact, it's our penultimate show of the year, we always devote a show to that year's Best American Comics volume. And I mean, there's the obviously lack of attention to the mainstream, and I can imagine that a lot of that has to do with just the permission and the copyright hoops and all that crap that you would have to go through in order to reprint something.
That is a part of it, but the main thing with that, I think, because we did try to include a couple of things that we couldn't include, like. It was amazing, actually. We wanted to include some of Batman Year 100, and DC just flat out would not let us use it. And I'm pretty sure that was Neil Gaiman's year that we wanted to do that, and they wouldn't even let Neil use it.
Wow.
Okay.
But maybe it wasn't. Actually, no. I think it was Linda Berry's year. Maybe that was why. I don't know. Anyway, like I don't think that they would say no now to that, but like they said no then. It was like the hoops that we would have to jump through to get that permission. I think they even just said flat out no, like you can't use it, which was just ridiculous. It was like totally crazy. So that kind of made us, that was like, ugh, why should we even bother? So there's that element. But more than that, the kind of work that comes out, we would look at stuff definitely. But a lot of times there's so much continuity in mainstream work that while there might be some great thing that's happening, it makes no sense if you don't already understand what's going on. Like even to us who are not deeply in the world of mainstream comics, but we're pretty good at judging good comics, people would be like, oh, there's this amazing arc in such and such a book. And we would look at it and be like, I have no idea what's going on here. Like, I don't get it. And I think that that's a legitimate way to judge something that's going to go into, just a few pages into a volume that is going out to the general public who does not know what's going on in X book,
Mm-hmm.
or an X book for that matter. That there's an insider knowledge necessary for not everything, but for many mainstream books that sort of precludes them being included in something like that.
What about work of publishers that aren't necessarily the big two, but are still biggies in the mainstream game, like let's say Dark Horse or Image? Many times you have limited series there, or maybe even one shots that probably deserve that kind of attention as well. Did you come across examples in your series editorship where maybe those became questions of whether to include, or maybe you ran into some kind of roadblocks in reprinting anything like that?
In which things? I'm sorry?
Well, in the Best American Comics, we were talking about some of the challenges of working with the mainstream, but even other publishers that I would consider mainstream, although on a smaller scale, like IDW or Dark Horse or Image, the kind of things that those guys put out are much more contained. Could those conceivably be included, or could some of those works have been included?
And we did. We included quite a bit of stuff that was from sort of like what's really the mainstream, the center, stuff that's sort of self-contained, and certainly in the notables, because like you got to look through the notables list to see what we picked. You know what I mean? Like whatever got into the actual book is, it's a selection that's based on individual taste of the individual editor that year. And, in some years we had quite a bit of stuff that I consider sort of from the center in that sense, 3 or 4 or 5 stories out of 30. But, we had a lot of trouble getting copies of stuff sometimes. Like we would go and buy things, but, we would, like with Image, for example, I would ask them to send me stuff and they just wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't get around to it.
Wow.
And so, and there was a lot of that. That's what I'm saying. Like that's that's the part I do not miss at all. So like we would go shopping at the comic book store and pick up stuff, but if it didn't have to happen to be in stock that day, I didn't necessarily, it's hard to keep track of everything like that. And it's like, we really just need stuff to come to us so that we can assess it. And so there was that as well. That was an issue.
Now you mentioned your work, your continued work on Trish Trash, and we can hope to see in the coming year English version of this. What else might you be working on in addition to Trish Trash and your podcast?
Nothing right now. That's it. That's enough.
Plenty to keep you busy.
Yes.
Well, Jessica, we want to thank you for taking the time and talking with us on the Comics Alternative, and good luck with the. Are you still on tour?
No, I'm back.
Okay, so that has wound down. So good luck with the podcast then.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. It was a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
Well, Derek, it was a really wonderful experience talking with Jessica Abel. I was able to talk with her just for a few minutes at SPX, and I know that you were not able to do that. So it was really a lot of fun to have her for an interview, and we could both speak with her.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I missed her at SPX the other week as well, especially since I had my copy of Out on the Wire that I wanted her to sign. I just got so involved with everything else that I was doing out there. But it was great talking with her about that book and also the other projects that she's worked on throughout her career. And, one of the things we did mention was her podcast and also the workshop. That's a big part of that. And if our listeners are interested in what this is all about, go to Jessica's website, and that is jessicaabel.com. That's one word, jessicaabel.com. And if you click on the podcast tab, then it will take you to a page for the show. If you sign up for the newsletter, then you will. That's the way to get an invitation for their Google Plus Hangout. So it's a great way of not only listening to what Out on the Wire is all about, but also being a participant in what they're doing with her podcast.
Yeah, and it's a great podcast. I've been listening to it and really enjoying it, as well as the book, too.
Yeah, and we found out after we turned off the recorder, in fact, that the next workshop episode of her podcast should be going up about a day or two after this episode, this interview show goes up.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely check out both the podcast and the new book, Out on the Wire. And if you like to find great comics, you would do well to go to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. And in fact, if you go to the website of their sister company, In Stock Trades, you can find some of Jessica's books there at great discounts. Unfortunately, Out on the Wire is not in Stock Trades warehouse, but you can find other books of hers, such as Drawing Words and Writing Pictures and Mastering Comics. Both of those are at 25% off. So instead of paying $34.99 for each, you would find them for $26.24. You can also find 20% discount on her book Life Sucks. So whether it's DCB Service or In Stock Trades, a great way to find comics, Jessica Abel related and otherwise. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're reading. We'd love to hear from you. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find in the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send a Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. But if you want to be a little more difficult about things, well, you can call us the old-fashioned way. Pick up the phone and dial 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you would like up-to-the-minute updates on content, new content to the blog and announcements, follow us on Twitter. We are at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And we sure appreciate all the people that follow us and retweet our tweets.
That's right. Keep them a-tweeting.
Yes.
You can also get in touch with us via email. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Andy, how can they get in touch with you directly?
You can contact me at Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. We even have a YouTube channel, so if you like to consume your media that way, well, check us out there. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. Lots of ways to get in touch with us.
Yes, and we do like to hear from you. So drop us a line and let us know what you thought about our conversation with Jessica Abel. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.